The House has resumed. The Government Order of the Day number 1, the Subantarctic Islands Marine Reserves Bill, has been called. Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Subantarctic Islands Marine Reserves Bill be now read a second time. Mr Speaker, we've just come from the Prime Minister's statement in which he outlined the ambition of this government to create a record number of marine reserves this year, and it's entirely appropriate that the House now works on progressing 3 very substantive marine reserves covering 430,000 hectares in the Subantarctic area. Mr Speaker, and I hear interjections from the Green Party, there's sort of the view that the bigger gains that are made for conservation and the environment are made by the political left. Let me put Mr Gareth Hughes correct. The Marine Reserves Act, which was a world leader, was passed in 1971 by a national government. The very first marine reserve created in New Zealand was in 1976, the Lee Reserve north of Auckland. Of the 34 marine reserves that have been created in New Zealand, the vast bulk of them have been created by national administrations, and we're proud of that. I'd also point out the term of this government passed the very important legislation to put in place proper environmental regulation of our exclusive economic zone. So this government, well, I interject, and I hear Moana Maki from the opposite side say that she questions that legislation. I remind that member that she and the Greens sat in this Parliament for 9 years, allowed deep-sea drilling, and did not raise a finger. Yes, they did. There was deep-sea drilling for 9 years during Labour's government with no environmental regulation, and not a squeak from the Green Party during that period, which really does expose the double standards that we witness in some of the arguments about the marine space. But, Mr Speaker, I am absolutely pleased that this bill receives very wide support of the Parliament, and I want to acknowledge the good work that the Select Committee, under Nicky Wagner's very able leadership, has made to this bill. I'd remind the House that the Subantarctic Islands does have World Heritage status, actually a status that I was involved in the 1990s when I was also Conservation Minister. What this Subantarctic Islands Marine Reserve Bill does is enable, through the collaborative process that was set up back in 2008, that provided a report to ministers in 2010, has proceeded with the agreement of the key stakeholders that participated in that forum on the creation of these new marine reserves in the Antipodes, in the Bounty and the Campbell Islands. Mr Speaker, this government does believe that the best way forward with issues like marine conservation is not the very long, the very protracted and the very divisive sort of arguments that we've seen in places like Akaroa, but actually getting stakeholders working together in that collaborative way that has delivered 5 proposed marine reserves on the west coast, these 3 marine reserves there, and another issue for the government to work through this year are the proposals for marine protection in Kaikoura that have come from the Te Korawai process. So, Mr Speaker, I do want to acknowledge the strength of that collaborative process that's brought about these proposals. Mr Speaker, there has been amendments proposed by the Select Committee in respect of the review of the reserve around the Campbell Island area. I think the changes that have been recommended by the Select Committee make good sense. There has been the issue of the timing, whether it should be 5 years before the review of the area in the Campbell Island takes place. That's been shortened by the Select Committee to 3 years. Given the fact that there's been 18 months pass in between time, that makes good sense and the government will be supporting those changes. Mr. Speaker, I would also acknowledge the improvements that have been made around the bill on some of the details. I know that with every environmental initiative that this government, or frankly the previous government, made, the Green Party always says is never enough. Nothing new about that. I'm going to have a heart attack the day the Green Party ever gets up and says, yes, that's good and that's enough and we're satisfied. It hasn't happened once. It hasn't happened once with any initiative by a Labor or national government in the 16-odd years that they have been part of this Parliament. The last point I want to make on this bill is just to note the very special ecology of the 3 subantarctic islands that we're looking to protect here. It is true that the ocean environment is the new frontier for conservation. 70% of the species that are endemic to New Zealand, 70%, actually are not on land where all the terrestrial concentration has been, are actually out there in the marine environment. And that is why this government is giving a particular focus to marine conservation. It is my intention, which I'd want to give the House notice of, Mr. Chairman, is that I intend to table an SOP during the committee stages, just to note that we want to bring the reserve in as quickly as possible after the passage of the bill. Other than that, I think it's good shape and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.